By the spring of 1944, the war in Europe had narrowed into schedules, coalitions, and margins for error. The fighting had not yet begun, but one sentence spoken in England nearly removed a general from the war before it started. This channel examines World War II through the moments when assumptions hardened, decisions narrowed, and history moved forward with fewer options than anyone expected. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. By April 1944, the Allied war effort in Western Europe rested on coordination rather than movement. The invasion of France had not yet begun. The beaches were still quiet. The ports were still German. The outcome would depend less on brilliance than on discipline, timing, and cohesion across a coalition that was already under strain. At the center of that coalition sat Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Allied Commander not for tactical originality, but for balance. His task was to hold together British and American forces, manage competing doctrines, and maintain political alignment with the Soviet Union while preparing the largest amphibious operation in history. This was the authority behind the Allied assumption. Victory in Western Europe would come from coordination. From consensus. From disciplined messaging as much as disciplined movement. Within that framework, George S. Patton was an anomaly that had already tested the system once. In August 1943, during the Sicily campaign, Patton struck 2 hospitalized American soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. The incidents were investigated, documented, and escalated. By the autumn of 1943, Patton was removed from operational command and placed in a holding pattern in England. The decision was quiet, but its meaning was not. He remained valuable. He was no longer trusted. By early 1944, that trust had not fully returned. Patton was not sidelined because he lacked results. His campaigns in North Africa and Sicily had demonstrated speed, aggression, and logistical competence. He was sidelined because he violated a different requirement of coalition warfare. Control. The Allied command believed something specific at this stage of the war. Public language mattered. Political perception was as fragile as any supply line. The Soviet Union, bearing the majority of German forces on the Eastern Front, had to believe it was treated as an equal partner. This belief was enforced daily through communiques, press briefings, and carefully prepared speeches. Senior officers were expected to understand that a careless phrase could travel faster than an armored division. Patton understood the rule. He did not respect it. In January 1944, Eisenhower approved a compromise. Patton would not return to frontline command, but he would be given responsibility for a fictitious formation, the 1st U.S. Army Group. Its purpose was deception. Inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, staged troop movements. The aim was to convince German intelligence that the Allied invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Patton was chosen because the Germans believed in him. His reputation was the asset. It was also the liability. By April 1944, Patton had been in England for months, surrounded by staff officers, liaison teams, and visiting officials. His movements were monitored. His remarks were expected to remain narrow and procedural. His role was defined. Perform the deception. Say nothing else. On April 25, 1944, Patton attended the opening of a small club for American troops in Knutsford, a quiet community south of Manchester. The event was informal. The audience was mixed. Officers, enlisted men, local civilians. Patton was told that his remarks would be off the record. He spoke briefly. According to contemporary press coverage and later staff recollections, Patton described the war as the joint destiny of the United States and Great Britain. He spoke of shared leadership, shared responsibility, shared victory. The Soviet Union was not emphasized. Later accounts suggest Patton made a brief, passing reference to the Russians. The remark did not survive the press cycle. What circulated instead was omission, not context. The following morning, British newspapers carried headlines accusing Patton of dismissing Britain's Russian ally. Within days, the story crossed the Atlantic. In Moscow, the interpretation hardened immediately. This was not treated as a verbal slip. It was received as intent. By late April 1944, Joseph Stalin raised formal objections through diplomatic channels. The Soviet leadership had long suspected that Britain and the United States might delay or dilute their commitment in the West. Patton's words appeared to confirm those fears. Inside Allied headquarters, the response was procedural rather than emotional. Memoranda were circulated. Press guidance was revised. Eisenhower requested assessments from his senior staff. One cable, sent by the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, left little room for ambiguity. According to later records, It warned that Patton had again exceeded acceptable limits, and that this incident might finally make his continued employment untenable. Patton had violated the core assumption of the coalition. That message discipline was not optional. This was not his first infraction. It was the third. The slapping incidents had raised doubts about judgment. Earlier speeches in North Africa had already required intervention. Now, with the invasion of France weeks away and Soviet confidence already strained, tolerance had narrowed. Eisenhower did not respond publicly. He did not reprimand Patton before the press. He asked his staff to prepare options. One option was obvious. Patton could be relieved permanently. Returned to the United States. The deception role reassigned. The risk removed. From an institutional standpoint, the logic was sound. Patton was not essential to the invasion plan. Other commanders could execute the campaign. Removing him would signal discipline to Moscow and stability to the alliance. By the final days of April 1944, the paperwork was drafted. What remained unresolved was whether the war could afford to lose him. As the plans for Normandy entered their final phase, the Allied command faced a narrowing set of choices. Political alignment demanded sacrifice. Military effectiveness resisted it. The clock was now ticking. By late April 1944, the Allied war effort had entered its most rigid phase. The invasion timetable was no longer conceptual. Shipping had been allocated. Units had been sealed into camps. Orders were being issued in drafts that would soon become final. Alterations were still possible, but only within narrow margins. At Supreme Headquarters, this rigidity expressed itself as procedure. Dwight D. Eisenhower approached crises through process rather than impulse. He asked for written assessments. He requested legal guidance. He weighed diplomatic consequence against operational risk. This method had served him well. It was how a coalition held together when its members did not share the same priorities or the same front. The assumption guiding Eisenhower's response to the Patton affair was institutional and widely shared. Individuals could be replaced. Systems could not. The alliance with the Soviet Union, strained by years of delay and suspicion, was considered more fragile than any single American general. This assumption had authority behind it. By 1944, the Red Army had absorbed losses that dwarfed those of Britain and the United States combined. Soviet forces were engaged across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German divisions that might otherwise reinforce the Atlantic Wall remained pinned in the east. The Western Allies' promise of a second front was not merely symbolic. It was the political foundation of the alliance. Any suggestion that Britain and the United States viewed the war as a bilateral project risked reopening doubts that had never fully closed. From this perspective, Patton's omission was not a personal flaw. It was a strategic liability. Within days of the Knutsford headlines, Allied diplomatic channels registered the Soviet reaction. Formal protests were restrained in language but firm in implication. The message was consistent. Trust was conditional. It could be withdrawn. Eisenhower did not dispute the interpretation. He did not argue intent. He treated the issue as one of consequence. According to staff records, he asked a simple question: could Patton remain in any visible role without further damaging the alliance? The early answers were not favorable. Patton's defenders within the American command did not dispute the facts. They argued relevance. The first U.S. Army group existed to deceive German intelligence. Its credibility depended on Patton's presence. Removing him would require retooling an operation already in motion. But credibility with Moscow was measured differently. It was not a matter of deception. It was a matter of posture. From the standpoint of Washington, the calculus was equally narrow. The Roosevelt administration had invested heavily in alliance messaging. Public opinion in the United States supported cooperation with the Soviet Union as a wartime necessity. Another Patton controversy risked undermining that support. The system's instinct, when under pressure, was to remove the variable. Patton was the variable. By the end of April 1944, the outline of a decision had taken shape. Patton would be relieved permanently. He would return to the United States. The deception apparatus would continue without him. The message to Moscow would be unambiguous. The logic was defensible. It was also incomplete. What the institutional model did not fully account for was timing. The invasion of France would not be won solely through careful alignment. Once ashore, it would require commanders capable of exploiting disorder, improvising under fire, and sustaining momentum when plans failed. These were not abstract qualities. They had been observed repeatedly in Patton's earlier campaigns. This was not lost on British commanders, many of whom viewed American personnel decisions with a different set of assumptions. Among them was Winston Churchill. Churchill was not involved in the initial assessments. He was not part of Eisenhower's chain of command. But he followed the Patton affair closely. He had encountered Patton before. He understood his flaws. He also understood his function. Churchill's own experience of coalition warfare had taught him something Eisenhower was still managing in real time. Alliances survive on discipline, but they win through force applied at the right moment. Removing an effective instrument on the eve of battle carried its own risks. According to later accounts from British staff, Churchill did not argue Patton's case publicly. He did not defend the speech. He did not contest the Soviet reaction. Instead, he framed the issue narrowly. The war was approaching a phase where killing power would matter more than diplomatic cleanliness. By early May 1944, the choice confronting Allied leadership had sharpened. Maintain political symmetry at the cost of operational flexibility, or tolerate a known liability to preserve a known advantage. The model favored removal. The battlefield did not. From here on, the war allowed fewer substitutions. By early May 1944, the Patton question had narrowed to procedure. The decision had not yet been signed, but its direction was visible. Draft orders circulated quietly. Travel arrangements were considered. The removal would be clean, administrative, and final. No announcement would be made until necessary. The objective was containment, not spectacle. From Eisenhower's perspective, this approach was consistent with how coalition crises were managed. He did not need consensus. He needed compliance. The Soviet response had to be acknowledged. The British position had to be respected. The American command had to demonstrate control over its senior officers. What remained was a matter of execution. It was at this point that Winston Churchill intervened, quietly and without ceremony. Churchill did not summon a conference. He did not raise the issue in public session. He did not seek to reframe Patton's remarks or soften their diplomatic impact. According to British staff records and later memoirs, he chose a narrower channel. A private message. The choice of method was deliberate. Churchill understood that arguing the politics would be futile. The alliance logic was already fixed. Stalin's reaction could not be undone. Press headlines could not be recalled. Defending Patton's intent would only reopen the argument on terrain already lost. Instead, Churchill addressed a different variable. Utility. In a message sent through back-channel communication to Eisenhower in early May 1944, Churchill acknowledged that the matter was Eisenhower's to decide. He did not question the authority of the Supreme Allied Commander. He did not dispute the necessity of alliance discipline. Then he added a single caution. "Whatever you decide," he wrote, according to later recollections preserved in official correspondence, "I hope you will not deprive us of his services in the battles which lie ahead." The phrasing was restrained. There was no appeal to sentiment. No defense of character. No reference to Patton's past victories. Churchill did not say Patton was innocent. He said Patton was useful. This distinction mattered. Churchill's argument did not conflict with Eisenhower's assumptions. It bypassed them. He accepted that Patton was a liability in peacetime terms. He argued that the war was about to leave peacetime terms behind. In British strategic culture, this was not an abstract point. Britain had spent years fighting alone, absorbing losses while managing commanders who were difficult, abrasive, and politically inconvenient. Churchill himself had defended officers whose public statements caused embarrassment because he believed their operational value outweighed their defects. According to post-war analysis by British historians, Churchill viewed commanders as instruments rather than representatives. The question was not whether they reflected alliance harmony. It was whether they could impose disorder on the enemy. Eisenhower received the message without reply. There was no immediate reversal. No annotation in the margin. No recorded discussion at that moment. The paperwork did not disappear. The process continued. But the logic had shifted. For the first time since the Knutsford incident, the Patton question was no longer framed solely as a problem to be solved. It was framed as a capability to be preserved. Eisenhower now had to weigh two forms of risk that did not align neatly. The diplomatic risk of retaining Patton versus the operational risk of removing him at the threshold of invasion. This was not a moral dilemma. It was a scheduling problem. The invasion of France would unfold in phases. Amphibious landings. Consolidation. Breakout. Exploitation. Each phase would demand different qualities from commanders. The early stages favored planners and coordinators. The later stages favored momentum and aggression. Patton was not essential to the first phase. He might be decisive in the last. By mid-May 1944, Eisenhower delayed the final order. No explanation was offered. The delay itself was the signal. Patton remained in England. The 1st U.S. Army Group continued its role in the deception plan. German intelligence continued to report Patton's presence opposite Pas-de-Calais as confirmation of their expectations. The alliance held. But the decision was no longer clean. Churchill had not saved Patton outright. He had complicated the removal. The door to dismissal remained open, but it no longer closed easily. From this point forward, the war imposed its own timetable. Once the invasion began, options would collapse rapidly. Personnel decisions that could be reversed in May would become irreversible in June. The question was no longer whether Patton deserved to stay. It was whether the war would allow his removal at all. From here on, delay became commitment. By June 1944, the problem resolved itself without a signature. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The deception plan held. German High Command continued to believe that the main invasion would still come at Pas-de-Calais. Armored reserves remained fixed in the wrong sector. The Atlantic Wall fractured unevenly. What had been theoretical in April became irreversible in June. The war had moved from preparation to execution. Once the landings began, the logic governing senior command decisions changed. Visibility replaced messaging. Performance replaced posture. The alliance could no longer afford internal disruption while forces were still fighting to secure a foothold on the continent. Patton remained where he was, still officially commanding a formation that did not exist. This was not mercy. It was inertia shaped by events. In the weeks following D-Day, the Western Front stabilized into a difficult, attritional struggle. Hedgerows limited movement. German units fought delaying actions. Casualties rose steadily. Progress was measured in villages rather than miles. The campaign did not yet reward speed. During this period, Patton remained sidelined, but not forgotten. According to staff records, Eisenhower continued to review command allocations for the later phases of the campaign. The invasion plan had always assumed that once the front expanded, additional field armies would be activated. Those armies would require commanders accustomed to operating independently, with long supply lines and limited supervision. By late June 1944, it became clear that the campaign would soon transition into that phase. On August 1, 1944, the U.S. Third Army was activated. Patton was assigned command. The decision was not framed as rehabilitation. It was framed as necessity. No announcement revisited the Knutsford scandal. No statement explained the reversal. The earlier paperwork was quietly superseded by new orders. The system did not admit error. It adapted. Once Patton entered the field, the logic that had nearly removed him collapsed completely. Within weeks, Third Army advanced faster than Allied planners had projected. German defenses buckled under pressure applied at multiple points. Logistics strained to keep pace. Fuel became the limiting factor rather than resistance. The very traits that made Patton politically dangerous became operationally valuable. Post-war assessments would note that Patton's command style was ill-suited to alliance diplomacy but highly effective in exploitation warfare. The war had entered a phase where exploitation mattered. From this point on, removing Patton would have required justification stronger than any diplomatic complaint. Success itself became insulation. What had begun as a disciplinary process ended as an obsolete concern. The scandal that nearly ended Patton's career did not disappear because it was resolved. It disappeared because the war outran it. By September 1944, attention had shifted to river crossings, supply crises, and the approaching German frontier. The earlier fears about Soviet perception remained, but they were overtaken by operational realities on the ground. The alliance adjusted its priorities accordingly. The choice that Eisenhower had delayed in May was no longer available in August. The battlefield had closed the door. From here on, Patton was no longer a risk to be managed. He was a force to be directed. And the war moved toward its next constraint. By early 1945, the war in Western Europe had narrowed again, this time toward geography. Germany's defensive depth had collapsed. The Ardennes counteroffensive had failed. Allied forces pressed eastward toward the final natural barrier before the German interior. That barrier was the Rhine River. For Allied planners, the Rhine represented more than a military obstacle. It was symbolic, administrative, and psychological. Crossing it marked the transition from liberation to occupation, from coalition advance to the dismantling of the German state. The crossing would be planned, documented, and photographed. Doctrine reasserted itself. According to Allied planning assumptions, major river crossings required overwhelming force, careful coordination, and controlled messaging. They were events to be staged, not moments to be personalized. Patton did not accept that framing. On March 23, 1945, elements of the U.S. Third Army crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim. The operation was executed quickly, with limited preparation, and achieved tactical surprise. German resistance was fragmented. The crossing succeeded without the delays planners had feared. Patton arrived at the site shortly after. According to multiple staff accounts and later memoirs, Patton stepped onto a pontoon bridge, faced the river, and urinated into it. He asked that the moment be photographed. A copy of the image was later sent to Eisenhower. There was no attempt to justify the act. No explanation followed. The gesture spoke for itself. It was not indiscipline in the conventional sense. It did not disrupt the operation. It did not confuse subordinates. It did not generate a diplomatic incident. It revealed temperament. 2 days later, on March 25, 1945, Winston Churchill crossed the Rhine as well, this time near the sector overseen by British forces. Churchill insisted on making the crossing in person, despite security concerns and staff objections. Once across, according to accounts recorded by those present, Churchill urinated on the German side of the river, near remnants of the Siegfried Line. Some versions place the act at the riverbank itself. The details vary. The intent does not. Churchill did not issue a statement. The act was not publicized at the time. It circulated later through memoirs and recollections. Like Patton's gesture, it served no operational purpose. It revealed something else. Both men treated the war as personal in a way few senior leaders did. Not emotional, not impulsive, but intimate. They did not view the conflict solely as an administrative problem to be solved. They experienced it as a confrontation to be completed. This shared temperament had never required proximity. They had not coordinated. They had not planned together. They did not need to. It explained why Churchill had intervened months earlier without defending Patton's conduct. He recognized the type. In Churchill's calculus, such men were dangerous in committees and indispensable in collapse. By the spring of 1945, this calculus had been validated by events. Patton's earlier scandals no longer framed his legacy. They had been overtaken by momentum. The alliance no longer debated his presence. It relied on it. The institutional assumptions that nearly removed him in April 1944 had not been disproven. They had been subordinated. Discipline remained necessary. Messaging still mattered. But the war's final phase demanded something else. Once the Rhine was crossed, there was no longer a place for the question that had once threatened Patton's career. The system had adapted by absorbing what it could not eliminate. From here on, the war moved toward conclusion, not correction. By April 1945, the war in Europe was no longer being shaped by planning assumptions. It was being closed by momentum. German resistance fragmented unevenly. Cities fell faster than they could be administered. Allied forces advanced beyond the limits of their own logistical forecasts. The conflict that had once been governed by coalition messaging now moved according to exhaustion, collapse, and proximity to Berlin. On April 12, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt died. The political architecture that had framed the alliance since 1941 shifted abruptly. Within weeks, the question of post-war alignment began to replace wartime coordination. By April 30, 1945, Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. The scandal that had nearly ended Patton's career a year earlier no longer required resolution. It had been overtaken by outcome. In post-war analysis, the Knutsford incident rarely appears as more than a footnote. It is usually cited as evidence of Patton's lack of restraint, his difficulty with modern warfare's political dimension. That interpretation is accurate, but incomplete. What the episode revealed was not merely a flawed individual. It exposed a structural tension within coalition warfare that no doctrine fully resolved. The Allied command assumed that discipline of language could be enforced without cost. That individuals were interchangeable as long as systems remained intact. That political cohesion could be preserved independently of battlefield effectiveness. Those assumptions were logical. They were supported by experience. They were reinforced by necessity. They were also brittle. Patton's near removal demonstrated how quickly a system built on consensus seeks to eliminate unpredictability. Churchill's intervention demonstrated something else. That in war's approaching decision, utility competes with alignment. Not rhetorically. Practically. Churchill did not save Patton because he admired him. He did not excuse his behavior. He did not challenge the alliance's political logic. He recognized that the war was about to enter a phase where its models would be tested by reality rather than theory. That recognition did not come from doctrine. It came from experience. Eisenhower's delayed decision reflected a different form of judgment. He did not defy the system. He allowed it to be overtaken by events. The invasion, the breakout, and the advance across France resolved the question without forcing a formal reckoning. The alliance survived because it adapted, not because it resolved its contradictions. After the war, Patton's reputation would remain unsettled. He would die in December 1945, before post-war narratives hardened. Churchill would leave office, return, and later write histories that emphasized process over personality. Eisenhower would become president, carrying with him lessons learned from holding together a coalition under pressure. The Knutsford scandal did not change the course of the war. It clarified its nature. World War II was not won by perfect alignment. It was managed through friction, through compromise, through toleration of men and methods that did not fit neatly within institutional expectations. What history learned too late was that coalition warfare does not eliminate dangerous personalities. It absorbs them, delays them, and deploys them when systems reach their limits. By the time that lesson became clear, the decision had already been made. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't decided in a single moment. It's shaped by timing, hesitation, and the decisions people make when options begin to close. If this perspective speaks to you, consider subscribing for future episodes. As the war itself would prove, once events are set in motion, they rarely wait for permission.